It was only a few years ago that I got into Magic the Gathering, and one of my very first commander decks was Niv Mizzet Perun. Now, in my initial research for the deck, I found myself on various forum posts, YouTube videos, and of course EDHREC, searching out the best possible cards to include. Now, I had my initial build of the deck, and it did feel strong. I still remember casting Curiosity for the very first time, and I realized that I was more or less stuck in an infinite loop. Good times. Well, good times for me, not for my friend Thad, who had to 1v1 me. But interestingly, I did start to notice that without my commander on the battlefield, my hand would run dry rather quickly. And as a new player, this really perplexed me. I had plenty of the Brainstorms, Ponders, Ops, and Serum Visions loaded in my deck, but they never seemed to do enough to keep my hand full. So then I went looking for the best deck building principles, and this is where I stumbled upon the likes of Game Nights and their mega popular video, the new Commander deck building template. I think that I actually saw their very older version first because that one wasn't quite out yet, but that's just splitting hairs. And in that video, they recommended a certain amount of card draw to go in the deck. Specifically, they recommend at least 10 pieces of card draw. So naturally, I go back to my deck, break it down, and sure enough, I actually have more than that. I have around 15 to 20 pieces of card draw, and this just stunned me. How could I possibly be running into issues with an empty hand when I have so much card draw in my deck? And the answer, as we'll find out in this video, is the difference of a single word: advantage. So let's review the specific definition of card advantage, and I'll tell you if I agree or disagree. Card advantage is a term for a deck or player getting access to the cards that they need. There are multiple resources in Magic, but the most basic and universal of those is cards, which obviously every deck contains. This could come in the form of more cards, such as by card draw or graveyard recursion, or efficiency of removal, such as board wipes or discard effects that leave the player with more cards than the opponent in the individual exchange. And I would say that that's pretty close to the definition, but why is any of this important? So just as in my previous example, in the beginning stages of the game, I was clearly conflating card draw with card advantage, and these two are not the same. Card advantage does include card draw, yes, but it also includes things like efficient removal or discard effects that leave you up on cards, and there's ultimately some effects that aren't really that obvious. Things like a pump spell to protect your creature from 2 or more blockers that your opponents are assigning, or maybe your opponent had to expend 2 or more damaging effects on a single one of your permanents, like a lightning bolt and a shock, for instance, to destroy your 5 toughness commander. It also includes something as simple as the mulligan. If you keep 7 in hand, but your opponent goes down to 6 or even 5, this is also card advantage in the true sense of the word. As you can see, card advantage has a very vast definition where card draw is much more narrow. But I think in order for us to actually be on the same page moving forward, we also need to review what card draw really means for us. Just because a card has the words draw a card printed on it does not actually mean that it supplies genuine card draw. In the literal definition, sure. If you have a commander or an effect like, for instance, Niv Mizzet Perun, that cares about you drawing a card, well, you can accomplish it with those effects. But if we're utilizing a broader and I'd argue much more accurate definition of what card draw is, it would be an effect, be it from a spell or ability that grants you access to more cards than what you spent to get them. Now, in this context, a spell or an effect never even has to use the words draw a card on it. Quite to the contrary. As long as whatever it is offers you access to more cards like a Fact or Fiction or a Scattered Thoughts, I would argue that it actually meets the definition of card draw. But interestingly, these cards also play on another trope that I don't hear discussed much regarding our deck building, and that is card selection. Now, card selection is something that I'm always excited to have in my decks. These are the effects that present multiple cards in some capacity, and then you have control over which ones you gain access to. Think about the aforementioned Scattered Thoughts. You are deciding which 2 of the 4 cards from the top of your deck that you keep, and then you ditch the others to the graveyard. That ability to dig further in your deck and then select the key pieces to quote-unquote draw is a really big deal. It gives you flexibility that a box standard draw spell does not have. Now, I'm going to give you 5 seconds just to guess what the most popular card selection spell in all of Magic the Gathering for Commander specifically is. Go ahead, guess. Well, if you guessed Ponder, then you would be wrong. Ponder only shows up, I say only, in roughly 270,000 EDH decks. Now, Brainstorm, on the other hand, shows up in a staggering 460,000 commander decks. Just crazy. Now, Brainstorm is a perfect example of what we've been discussing so far. It literally uses the word draw a card. I mean, it's printed right there. In fact, it says draw 3. But let's look at the actual effect. So you're going to draw 3 cards, but then you're going to put 2 back on top of your library. That's the effect. So you expend 1 card, which is the Brainstorm, to draw 3. We're up by 2 cards now, but then you have to put 2 of those back. So what does that leave us with? A card advantage of 0, meaning there is no card advantage. You see, you never really advanced anything. Of course, Brainstorm will be eternally useful in anything that actually wants to see you draw a card, like the aforementioned Niv Mizzet Parun. It'll also be great in any type of Spellslinger deck, but when you're paying nearly $1 for a common, you'd expect it to do a little bit more heavy lifting in your decks. Moreover, I would argue that as commander players, we're running far too many of these types of card draw effects in our decks. Ask any typical commander player in blue why they have either a Brainstorm or Ponder in their list, and I bet a good majority of the time they'll answer because it's good, duh idiot, or because they needed card draw. My friends, this is not card draw. This is card selection, and I think that we can do much better. Now, I'm going to say a word, and then you're going to say it back to yourself. Ready? Repeatable. Repeatable. Repeatable is the word that's going to end all card hunger in the EDH community. When we're making a determination regarding card draw in our deck specifically, we need to decide on a few things to figure out if it's actually going to be worth our time. As previously mentioned, does it give us card advantage? We've already reviewed this. This card will pay for itself and another to replace itself. Does it offer us card selection? Does it allow us to look at and dig deeper? For instance, does it meet the actual criteria of card draw? Meaning, will it actually replace itself and more? But maybe even more importantly than that, is it repeatable? Now, I've begun to auto-include certain cards in more of my archetypal decks because of the repeatable nature of them. So let me just list a few here for you so we can get some ideas. Things like Welcoming Vampire, or Chivalric Alliance, Protection Racket, Mystic Remora, duh, any of the Elemental Bond or Beast Whisper type effects, Bidon of Thassa, as well as things like Reconnaissance Mission, Skull Clamp, Monastery Siege, which is more or less repeatable card selection. You get the picture. Anything that can stick around, accruing value over the course of a turn cycle, or stick around to trigger on my subsequent turns. Now, it's impossible to list every single version of this, so just ask yourself the next time you are putting a Brainstorm in your commander deck if it's really necessary. Or would an alternative, repeatable form of card draw actually be of a greater benefit to your deck? Most often, the answer is yes. And let me be clear, this isn't really an advertisement for Rhystic Study, and I'm not trying to hold your hand with every individual decision. Now, I do have to disclose that I purchased 500 copies of Rhystic Study over the past couple of weeks in preparation for this video for legal reasons that has to be disclosed. To put it plainly, Rhystic Study for most pods is far too strong and backbreaking. But it is those things because it embodies exactly the principles that we've been discussing in this video. It draws you cards in the true sense of the word. It offers you card advantage, typically going card positive just in a single turn rotation. And it indirectly offers you card selection, because oftentimes, when I've played it at least, I have to discard down to hand size again and again throughout multiple turn rotations unless someone has removal for it. And to be clear, in Commander, a lot of the time at least, people do not have specific enchantment removal. So Rhystic Study is powerful, because it offers us those three things in spades. And this is why the discussion of card advantage is so important. When you start to master it, your Commander games will get easier, your decks get better, and you could subscribe to my Patreon down in the description below. After all, this video is going to help you win dozens and dozens of games. That has to be worth a sub, right? Now, that's really the bread and butter of this topic. If you just stop here in the video, you'll be able to walk away with hopefully some golden nuggets that you can use in your future deck building, all wrapped up with a neat little bow for you. But if you're a degenerate cardboard crack addict like myself, you're going to love what I'm about to show you. We're going to talk about various situations where theoretical card advantage comes into play. These are situations where you aren't physically up on cards, but you might as well be up on cards. The first, and also probably the most obvious instance of theoretical card advantage, is killing an opponent. Now, killing an opponent removes them from the game, but by proxy, that also removes every single card on their board and from their deck from the game as well. Dealing that last point of damage with a lightning bolt, for instance, just resulted in a 100 for 1. You effectively dealt with their entire deck for the low cost of one card. And more than that, you also remove any of the theoretical cards that they could have played on later turns if you had given them the chance to take their turn. Now, this may sound satirical, but if you're knocked out prior to playing your 6 or 7 cards that you have in hand, then you might as well have never drawn them in the first place. The key is knowing when to actually deploy this information. This comes in avoiding certain game situations that are knowingly disadvantageous for you, such as attempting to beat an opponent in the card advantage race when their deck has the chance to go long, but yours does not. Now, as a really great example to this, my friend has a Sig River Cutthroat deck that basically draws a card during every single end of turn, resulting in him getting way ahead of each other player at the table. Now, the best way to deal with that type of crippling card advantage is to basically just remove him from the game. So use your words at the table to form an alliance to remove key pieces, or simply push to eliminate that player before they can accrue so much advantage that the game is lost for the table. And especially in 1v1 situations, this is important. For instance, when your opponent is inching ahead of you, and this may be more applicable in limited formats, but I think it paints a good picture, knowingly making a card negative play, like attacking with creatures that you know are going to die, but some of them will get through to deal that key damage to end the game, can actually be the correct play. You're not going to win on the axis of card advantage, so just don't even try it. Make the winning play and simply go face. Now you know, and knowing is half the battle.
And knowing is half the battle.
My editor specifically said LMAO here, so I'm going to keep this in the video. Thanks, Jacob. Second, sometimes the board state results in certain cards being absolutely useless for your opponents. Now, a really easy example of this is having a 3/3 on your side of the board and your opponent having 3 2/2s. The 3/3 can't attack in because it'll simply get double blocked by your opponent, and that's a really poor trade and it sucks for you. But what's actually worse in most cases is your opponent swinging all of those 2/2s at you, because you're going to be able to effectively block all of them, which results in a situation where your 3/3 is actually killing every single one of those 2/2s over an additional 2 turn cycles. You're effectively 3 for 1ing an opponent with this simple 3/3. Now, importantly, they don't even have to attack you for this theoretical 3 for 1. By virtue of you having this solid blocker, you are generating card advantage and keeping your life total healthy. And admittedly, in Commander, this is also the importance of literally having any blocker at an early stage. In many different situations, just by virtue of me having a blocker at an early stage of the game, I was able to prevent the Inflect player from killing me at an early to mid-game stage, or the Voltron player from latching onto me like a rabid dog. It results in situations where those other decks will KO another player, which diverts hate away from you and gives you time to build your board and get ahead at a later stage of the game. Third, understanding an opponent's synergies allows you to actually control the flow of the game and oftentimes ensure card advantage over the course of said game. Now, this can come in the context of destroying a known combo piece, like destroying a very heavily costed commander that is necessary to the deck strategy. But it could also just mean destroying something as simple as a Lord effect in like a zombie or merfolk tribal deck. Those Lord effects add up over the course of the game and oftentimes give the deck an unnecessary edge that you could otherwise easily eliminate. In certain situations, the answer to a skull clamp, for instance, is not destroying the skull clamp itself, but by actually removing the creatures that can otherwise be targeted with the skull clamp. Or if an opponent is about to get ETB value on a creature entering the battlefield, a well-timed counterspell will prevent that excessive value and is often the difference between winning or losing in certain situations. Now, this may sound really simple, but stick with me because I promise you it's more complex than that. What we're discussing here requires intimate knowledge of the game and your group. It's not as simple as just destroying a key piece. It's the identification of your opponent's synergies and then selectively holding up removal until the time is right. Plenty of times in my games, I've held up counter magic knowingly for a certain set of cards that are in my opponent's deck. Throughout the course of the game, there are plenty of situations and plenty of really threatening cards that would have been good for a counterspell, but without knowing that I'm going to have access to another, I need to hold this so I can for sure counter my opponent's win condition. Now, I hold it in hand, waiting for one of those cards to come out, and once they finally play it, once they finally play that key synergy piece, I finally get to deploy my counterspell and stop them from proceeding to a win. Now, this actually results in a ton of card advantage for you if it's done correctly. That card that I just countered, yes, could have won my opponent the game, and that is card advantage in the true sense of the word, but it could have also just drawn them a ton of cards, or it could have wiped away mine and my opponent's boards while leaving theirs intact. You get the picture. Now, card advantage is oftentimes not even related to you drawing cards or wiping away your opponent's board states, for example. Sometimes card advantage is just you preventing those key pieces that they would have otherwise needed to push over the finish line, because you are no longer in the game if they're eliminating you. So selectively holding up this removal can, in many cases, act as a sort of quasi-card advantage. Fourth, and I consider not even putting this one in here, but there's been so many instances where this has been proven true to me that I feel like it's actually necessary to put out to the world. And that is sometimes a looting effect can make the difference between a win or a loss for you. Now, in multiplayer formats, especially in casual Commander, it becomes inevitable that we're going to reach a state of the game where things like lands or ramp spells or our low-costed dorks are just extremely bad options to be playing out, and you would be much better suited to use it as discard fodder. Now, this also means that card advantage can take on the hat of something like a Surveil or a Scry or an Explorer, those types of effects in the late game. Sure, those same effects are okay at an earlier stage of the game. They can smooth things out for you, but if the game reaches that stalemate where people are either top decking or you don't have access to the cards that you need immediately, they suddenly become so much better because they allow you to dig your deck more effectively and get answers to the current state of parity that you've reached. And if you want a whole video on parity, that was my last one that I just did, so make sure you go check that one out once you're done with this video. So a regular old merfolk looter, for instance, can sometimes be your MVP in the late stage of the game. And if you find yourself running into these frequent late game scenarios where your hand is filled with useless early game material, it may be a sign that you need to run more of this style of card effect, especially if you can utilize your graveyard. Think about any Reanimator build, for instance. I also just want to throw this in here. It's not scripted at all, but I think effects like Impulse Draw can also somewhat fall into this category. Having an effect like Wild Wasteland, which is in my Ovika Enchantress deck, another video that you can go watch once you're done with this one, has really paid dividends because getting access to 2 cards effectively at the beginning of every turn allows me to actually propel myself to a later stage of the game. And yeah, it's not perfect. I would argue that it's maybe not quite as good as like a looting effect, just because you get access to whatever you're going to filter out of your hand, and you can also, and more importantly, set up key cards into your graveyard. But I think that they're still worth considering, especially if they're offering you access to more cards than they cost to actually deploy themselves. Finally, and this one requires a little bit of nuance and understanding of your local metagame, you can actually be ahead on card advantage even if your opponents have drawn more cards than you, if they simply can't actually play those cards. Now, this is also where we can discuss stacks pieces, but it's also where we get to talk about effects like an Allosaurus Shepherd, and this is a simple low to the ground card that makes your green spells uncounterable. So let's just assume that we have the Shepherd out on the board and continue on with our example. You have 6 cards in your hand and your opponent has 7, but they have 3 counter spells in their hand and no way to directly interact with your board. So you're actually playing a game where you have 6 in hand and they have 4 effective cards that they can deploy. And this is a great situation to find yourself in. And I've personally experienced this a few dozen times where my opponent's hand was dead due to these uncounterable effects such as the Shepherd. And yes, stacks pieces clearly fall into this department as well. If you make it hard for your opponents to use the resources that they're getting access to, you can create situations of card advantage even without actually being ahead on any type of physical material. Again, this is highly dependent on your local meta, and for me personally, I find that running these uncounterable effects oftentimes can be just as effective in a casual setting, whereas typical stacks pieces are irritating for the entire table. For instance, I'm more likely to get invited back to a group if I pub stomp you with a tutored out Craterhoof Behemoth, whereas if I was playing out Athalia and increasing the cost of all of your spells, I'm likely never going to get invited back. Commander players are really weird like that. But I think that you can learn from this and include those types of effects, especially uncounterable effects like the Allosaurus Shepherd, to by proxy win more games. I promise you that you'll experience that as well. So whether you're playing casual or competitive, just remember that card draw in no way equals card advantage. Whether you're physically going up on cards, accruing resources at the table, deploying a one-sided board wipe, preventing your opponents from drawing key cards, removing or countering a key piece that your opponent needs, or simply killing someone, you're building card advantage in your game. Now, I'd like to challenge you today to actually start cutting these excessive card selection effects like Ponder, Brainstorm, Serum Visions, Opt, and I would opt for more progressive and repeatable forms of card draw, things that can actually accrue advantage over the course of the game rather than a one and done type of effect. Experiment. I mean, without actually giving these cards a try and taking the leap to implement them into your games, you'll never truly know what you're missing out on. And finally, when you hear folks talk about the importance of including enough types of card draw in your deck, don't be like me and include cards like Brainstorm. Go back to the drawing board and rework your deck so that way you can accommodate actual card draw effects, the ones that have the propensity to go card positive over the course of the game. Your gameplay experience and your win rate are going to thank you. And let me be really clear here. I'm not saying to not include a Brainstorm, especially if it has good synergy with your deck. Like a Niv Mizzet Perun, for instance, would love you to have access to a Brainstorm. You're going to get so much value off of it. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the generic effects that you're putting in there, like the Brainstorm, to just meet your quota of card draw. Those types of situations where you're just trying to get enough card draw, Brainstorm and Ponder and Opt aren't going to cut it. In the situation where you do have a commander like Niv Mizzet Perun or it cares about specifically instants and sorceries, it's more of a discussion. But by and large, across the entirety of the game, I would argue that we're using these cards way too much. Now, if you like this style of video and you want more, subscribe to the channel so I know that you want me to keep making them. And if you want to directly support the production of not only these types of topic-driven videos, but also my upcoming gameplay series on the channel, go ahead and check out my Patreon and subscribe over there. A massive thank you again to my beautiful friends for taking time to sit down and edit the script, Elijah and Jacob. Thank you so much. And also for ensuring that I'm not becoming a raving madman. They wrote, actually, it's too late, Kyle. You're already a madman. Stop fooling yourself. Interesting. And also a huge thank you to everybody who subscribed to my channel over the last few weeks. Like, we're officially over 5,000 subscribers. And by the time this goes live, I think we're approaching 5,500. This is just crazy exponential growth for the channel. And I really hope to see it continue in that type of upward trajectory. As always, I hope that you have more and better games of Commander. And I'll see you very soon for another video. Bye, guys.